I took Emmy home, and finally after a night of celebrating we went to bed. After she was asleep, I kissed her forehead and snuck out. I had to do this alone, and honestly, I hoped she would forgive me for it. I didn't know what was going to happen with this, and I didn't want her going down with me if things went horribly. I left a note explaining why for her, packed my dagger that Arthur gave me and the gun I had bought, dressed in a black hoodie and blue jeans. I tossed on a thin leather coat to help me with the cold that had crept in with the new coming snow, and left my house for what I hoped wasn't the last time. The drive to my mother's home seemed to go on forever, honestly. Images of my childhood, of times with Justin, and more kept coming to mind. I had to honestly pull over a few times to cry. I guess the loss of my last remaining parent finally sank in since it was the first time since I actually thought of it. After a few moments had passed, enough for me to get a grip on my feelings and move on. There would be time for sorrow when this was over, if I survived. If we survived, I should say. I was going to save Justin, or I was going to go down with him. I didn't want to live in a world where I caused the death of all my family. I don't think I had it in me to live on with that knowledge. After what seemed like an eternity with just me, falling snow, silence, and my ever slipping into depression mind, I finally arrived at their house. It didn't look like anything had changed. It definitely didn't look like the home of 2 reanimated corpses and a demon-possessed 3-year-old kid. The snow had covered the yard with a few inches of pure white snow and almost made the place look peaceful despite knowing what was inside. I turned off my car, sat for a second in complete silence of the night, then got out. I walked slowly through the yard, stopping at the porch. I could make out the high marks I had started notching into one of the posts on the front porch. I kneeled down, rubbed my fingers over the last one, remembering the day this happened. How proud he looked to see his growth. He had a huge smile on his face as he jumped up and gave me a big bear hug. I sighed and stood. It was time to get this over with. I reached out for the doorknob, and as I touched it, a searing pain shot through where my finger used to be before the demon-possessed Justin tore it free. I pulled my hand back and flexed my hand. It wasn't hurt, no damage or bleeding. I shook my head and reached for it again, only to have the same result as I touched the knob. Shaking my head in frustration, I leaned back and kicked the door, harder than I intended to, but it seems I decided to take part of my frustration out in that kick. The area around the knob shattered as the door opened, and the knob flew forward into the pit past it. I say pit because it definitely wasn't the living room I had known before. It looked like a swirling green, black, and red mass. The doorknob flew on through the swirling expanse and disappeared into its depths. I heard a roar erupt from seemingly nowhere, but everywhere, at once. The porch beneath me began to shake and I started to jump back. But mid-jump, a large 4-fingered white glove and very familiar hand reached out and grabbed my leg. I was helpless and fell back with momentum and cracked my head on the porch, hard. Everything went to a searing white before fading into black. The last thing I heard was an extremely familiar laugh echo through the darkness, and I was out. I woke up on a couch, my mom's couch. I jumped up and immediately regretted it. The sudden movement sent imaginary needles through my brain, and I had to wince and grit my teeth to stop from crying out. After a few agonizingly long seconds, the pain passed and I started to regain clear vision. Around me was my mother's living room. My mom was sitting in her rocking chair knitting away at a blanket, and my stepfather was there watching TV in his recliner. "Oh, you are awake, honey. Are you okay? You had a real nasty spill on our porch outside. Must have slipped on the ice." My mom spoke out to me, as she noticed my reclaimed consciousness. My brain was still foggy, and it was hard to piece together coherent thoughts for me to speak out. I settled with an eloquent, "Huh?" I heard her chuckle and stand up, setting her crochet work down. She walked over and sat a cold, extremely cold, hand on my forehead and sat next to me. She raised a finger up in front of my face. "Look at me, honey. Follow my finger, okay? I have to make sure you didn't get a concussion or anything from that nasty fall you took." I complied, following her finger as it slowly traced around my field of vision. "Well, good news. You are going to live, honey. Now I have to ask, why the sudden visit?" I rubbed the back of my head, finding a bruised spot right at the back of my skull, and winced as I did. Luckily, though, my thoughts were forming more coherently by the moment. I wanted to check on you guys. The snow, it came suddenly. I also wanted to make sure Justin was okay. What was I saying? Wasn't she killed along with my stepdad? Wasn't this entire room a swirling abyss before I was knocked out? Oh, that is sweet, honey. We missed you, you know. We do. I know why you were really here. You were here for Justin. You were here to stop that horrible mouse from controlling him anymore. I sighed and lowered my head. I thought you were dead, and I don't know where this is. She leaned in and hugged me. We are, honey. We were killed by that horrible mouse, and he has been using our bodies to hide what is going on. I started to pull back in fear, thinking I fell into a trap. Shh, honey. It's not what you are thinking right now. You aren't awake, really. You are in between dreaming and dying. That blow to the head almost killed you, but you managed to avoid dying. Look, I don't know how long we have. I don't know how long you're going to be here. I can't answer who or what. Let us speak to you. That isn't allowed. I can tell you that it wants you to succeed, though. It says it's a mess, that he should have stopped, but he couldn't. It has to be someone related to a host for that thing that can do it. He told me to tell you only kindred blood can cut through the filth and show the core. He also wanted to give us a chance to tell you something. I didn't realize it, but I had started to cry. Tears fell down my cheek. They were really dead. Everything was true. For a second I had started to think this was some dream. Now stop that, Edward. This isn't the time for that, you know. She wiped away the tears and kissed my forehead. I don't blame you, son. Neither of us do. You had no way of knowing what was in those tapes. Stop blaming yourself. Stop feeling guilty for something you couldn't know. Look, son, I love you. I want you to know that, and I want you to help your brother. There isn't much more time. I can feel everything going. You are waking up. Save Justin, Ed. I know you can. I have never doubted it. Goodbye, son. She hugged me again, and I hugged back. Goodbye, Mom. I managed to speak out before it all faded into darkness again. I woke up on a hardwood floor. I opened my eyes with a horrible pain in the back of my head. Instead of the warm, relaxing living room I woke up last time in, all around me was broken furniture, wood, cloth, and red substances of I didn't want to know what. Slowly and painfully, I stood up. Sitting on the only undamaged chair in the room was Bumbo. Next to him, in a dark metal cage, sobbing heavily, was Justin. He saw me stand up and started to reach for me, but Bumbo put a white cloth over his cage and silence fell beneath it. Now, Justin, there isn't time for a reunion with your big brother. He and I have some business to settle, don't we, Edward? I started to regain clarity in my head despite the thundering stampede inside it. You're damn right, Mouse. You're going to give me Justin back, and I'm going to send your sorry ass back to hell where you belong, to go back to scrubbing floors or demon toilets, whatever it is you sorry peons do there. He laughed. His cartoony form shifted and distorted for a moment, and sitting in the chair was his decayed, maggoty form I had seen several times. Edward, you don't seem to understand where you are or who I really am. He pulled out the tapes from his tattered pants pocket and tossed them at me. You think these will stop me? Go ahead. Destroy them with that silver dagger you have. I won't stop you, by all means. Somehow the 3 tapes stayed together in the air, and I caught them. I only had to take a look at them for a second before I knew what he had done. I tossed the tapes aside into the nearest wall and let them shatter from the force. Those weren't the tapes, Bumbo. He laughed and stood up, growing larger as he did, until he was easily 3 feet taller than me. He took the few steps it took to cross the room at his size to me and stared down at me. I almost like you, Ed. You're stubborn. You're strong when you need to be, and despite staring up at a demon from hell, you aren't flinching. It is impressive for a mortal. I smiled a bit up at him, putting on a show to hide the fact I was secretly wanting to piss my pants right now. That's funny, because I can't stand your rotten guts, you filthy Mickey Mouse knockoff. My snide words rewarded with a backhand that sent me to the wall where the tapes were. I heard wood cracking as I hit it, and everything went white for a second, but kept hold of consciousness. I coughed and wiped my mouth to see a little blood that had come from my mouth. I fished my tongue around inside to find that I had bit the inside of my lip from the strike. Aside from that, I seemed more or less together. Screw Bumbo. That wasn't very nice, I said as I stood up and pulled the dagger out from its sheath I had at my side. He laughed as I did this. You really think that little letter opener Arthur gave you will hurt me? Silver or not, a human can't hurt a demon here in its home, with its host by its side. You are nothing but a tiny roach to me, a bug that I am going to squish. After all, a house shouldn't have cockroaches inside it. It looks bad on the homeowner. I saw him swing his hand at me, and my instincts luckily took over at that time. I jumped to the side to avoid his fist, which connected with the wall and shattered it around his gloved, ghoulish hand. As he pulled it out, bits of rotten flesh and maggots clung to the bits of broken wood. I resisted the urge to hurl at seeing this, but for reasons beyond my knowing to this very day, it made me think. Only kindred blood can cut through the filth and show the core. I wiped the pooling blood in the corner of my mouth and rubbed it on the silver dagger. Then while he was still pulling his arm back, I ran at him. He reached out with his other arm to grab me, but I dropped to the ground and slid with the momentum towards him. I slashed out at his leg as I passed him, and then he roared in pain. Greenish-brown, rotten-smelling ichor covered the knife now, and I swung it in the air to shake it off. It flew off and hit the wooden planks to my side before hissing and bubbling away to a sticky-smelling vapor. I didn't have time to think much more on anything or let my mouth bleed more. I slashed at my left arm, since I held the knife in my right, and cut my arm deeply. Blood coated the edge of the knife and started to trail down my arm. I stood, and before Bumbo could stand and turn his lumbering, rotten form face to me, I jumped at him. I roared some incoherent battle cry and sank the bloody silver knife into his back. It sank in like a hot knife through butter. I held onto the knife and pulled it down with me, cutting through every inch of flesh between where I landed and the floor. Bumbo roared in pain and fell back down to both knees after a failed attempt to stand. All pain was gone from me now. All thought was too, though. In the black and green ichor flowing from the giant wound I had just cut in Bumbo, I saw something black. I moved the dagger to my left hand and reached in with my right to grab what I hoped was the tape. No, Edward, no! Bumbo screamed out, and I sank my arm into his wound and grabbed the black bundle of VHS tapes. The rotten, pungent, bloody ichor from his body burned my arm, but I gripped the tapes like a shipwrecked sailor grabbing a life raft and yanked with all the strength my body could muster. They refused to budge. I put my foot up onto Bumbo's back and pulled again, this time wrenching the tapes out from their hole with a sickening slurp sound. I fell back from the effort and landed on the floor behind me. Free from my arm inside his body, Bumbo started to turn while unable to stand to reach out for the tapes. Without taking any more time, I flipped the knife in my grip and brought it down onto the bundled VHS tapes. The knife sank straight through them and lodged into the wood below. Bumbo roared in agony. He started to twist and contort, evaporating in the same decay-smelling mist as ichor did. The residue that coated my arm began to evaporate with him. In a last effort, Bumbo reached out at me while disappearing, to grab me. I couldn't move anymore. I had nothing left to give after that. I just sat, breathing heavily from exhaustion, and watched. His hand evaporated before it reached me. I heard distorted words through his roar of pain, through his agony. I couldn't make them out well at the time, but for some reason they reverberated through my mind. With the demon mouse gone, I took a few moments to catch my breath and look at my arm. It looked like acid had eaten through my skin, leaving some very nasty chemical burns covering nearly all of it. I pulled the rolled sleeve of my hoodie down over it and winced as the fabric touched the wounds. I couldn't have Justin see this. He had to be through enough. I stood up and grabbed the dagger from where it stuck into the wood. I placed it back into the sheath it came in and walked over to the cage Justin was in. As I lifted the white cloth, underneath was Justin. He was asleep, curled up not in a black metal cage, but in his crib. He was dressed in the same pajamas I had seen in him last at my home. It was hard to believe that it had only been a little over a month since this had started when I looked down at him, curled up and sleeping with his thumb in his mouth. I leaned over the crib ledge and picked him up, holding him close. I cried then. I sat back in the chair Bumbo had sat in, held Justin, and cried. He woke up for a second, and in his groggy, half-sleepy stupor he looked at me, smiled a big grin, and laid his head back down on my shoulder and passed back out. I hugged him closer for a second, then stood and made my way out of the house. I tucked Justin in best I could in my back seat. Since I didn't have a car seat, I had to make do with wrapping him in a blanket, then putting him in the middle and crossing the seatbelts from side to side to make a big X over him. I sat in my driver's seat and started the car. It was here that the words Bumbo had said in his scream of pain made sense. "There are copies still. I will see you again soon." My blood ran cold in my veins when it came to me. I thought this had ended, but if I could believe his last words, it wasn't. Somewhere out there, God knows how many copies of those tapes. I had destroyed the originals, and it seems I managed to force him back to wherever he came from for some time. But sometime, somewhere, are tapes of his, and he could come back to get Justin again. I took a deep breath and put my car into drive. I couldn't worry about that now. For now, at least, I have Justin back, and I know what it takes to stop him now. I will have to just take this win for now and go. I just hope whoever reads this, they learn from my mistakes, and they do not watch those tapes. If you ever find any tapes of Bumbo the Singing Mouse, destroy them. Do whatever it takes. But for God's sake, don't watch them.